episode of the Manufacturing Hub with myself and Dave. Today, we're going to be recapping some of the conversations we've had around the robotics theme, but we're also going to have a discussion between Dave and I and to understand and I guess dig into our experience a little bit deeper when it comes to robotics, explore maybe different opportunities, talk about different challenges, and ultimately give our own expert opinion on the topic, or at least as much of an expert as we both are. That being said, Dave, if I want to start us off, we had a first conversation with Pavel Krupa back on the first week, and Pavel introduced robotics in general to us, but also dove in fairly, I want to say, in depth on the technical side and sort of explained, what kind of challenges there are between like different brands, different applications. He talked a lot about what it takes to maybe optimize, not only the let's call it like the purchase of a robot, but also when it comes to maintaining the robot, changing the program, and who might benefit more from one platform versus another when it comes to different groups as the life cycle of the robot sort of continues. What were your thoughts on that conversation?
Yeah, I thought it was a really good conversation. Vlad, I'll tell our listeners kind of what I told you and what I told Pavel immediately after we got off. But it feels like very infrequently do you and I get to sit and kind of listen to someone go super in depth about a topic that they are one exceptionally passionate about, and two, you and I don't know nearly as much as they know about it. And so I thought kind of kicking off talking about the differences between FANUC robots and ABB robots and Cougar robots. I thought that that was super interesting, kind of the similarities and the differences going and looking at European design versus going and looking at Asian design, all the way into like one of them uses grease and one of them uses oil, and grease is good for some applications and oil is good for other applications. And so I thought that that was an awesome conversation. I super appreciated that. I will also point out something that I realized as we were finishing up with Ryan, that Pavel comes with a fairly large background in automotive, right? So he does lots of automotive applications, and then we went and we had conversations with people that basically do everything else other than automotive. There's a little bit of automotive in there, but I feel like the majority of our conversation with Pavel was very automotive focused. And I thought it was super interesting when we go and look and we compare and contrast the similarities and the differences between everything that kind of Pavel's experience versus everyone else's experience. What were your key takeaways?
Yeah, I thought like those contrasting points were very interesting, right? So I certainly learned a lot when it comes to, and you gave like one example with grease versus oil, but I think you also talked about the programming side, the ease of, I guess, like setting up a robot, but also the differences in how the paths are, let's call it like optimized and how you can do some of the fine tuning. So I learned quite a bit when it comes to the differences between those brands, and I know that Pavel works I think predominantly with Kuka, Fanuc, and ABB, but it was certainly interesting to have him like dig a step deeper and kind of explain what it really is like in the field. So I think like for me, the takeaways have been a lot like on the technical side. I didn't know there were all those differences for me, at least in my conversations, where well, like generally speaking, probably any robot can move a object, from point A to point B. And for the most part, there's not a whole lot of differences when it comes to them. So I was, I guess, a little bit surprised to learn that there's actually a lot more that goes into it. I obviously understand there's like maintenance items, but I've never had to, let's call it, understand whether like grease or oil would be better, right? So I think to some people that might be extremely important. And I think that hopefully after they saw our stream, they'll pay closer attention to those items. But ultimately, again, it's interesting to understand those nuances. So those would be my takeaways.
Absolutely. I thought that that was really good. I will make the plug. that Pavel, he has built a bunch of robotic training content on solosplc.com. So you guys can go ahead and take a look at that if you're interested to learn more about robotics. And beyond that, I know he has his own YouTube channel and he puts out a bunch of super interesting content about that. I guess, no, I should rephrase, a bunch of super interesting, exceptionally high quality content when it comes to that. So I would absolutely suggest and recommend you guys go ahead and take a look at that. Episode 133. Let me ask you, Vlad, but before we move on to the next conversations, has this made you want one particular type of robotic arm more than other types of robotic arms, or are you just looking to have a couple of different robots come in to be able to do things like give you coffee and refill your water?
I think if any, it didn't necessarily make me want one or the other, but it made me,
Mhm,
like I said, realize that it's not just, you visit one of those websites or talk to a distributor and buy kind of like whatever works. Like a
mhm,
lot more research, or I guess like a lot more considerations should go into purchasing a robot, right? So I think that prior to that conversation, like I said, I thought the process was fairly straightforward. You could probably go
mhm,
to any of them, and depending on whom you're standardized on, should probably be your best choice. But now that I saw all of those like parameters, and I guess there's also, he talked about like different options that people are not always aware of, right? So when
mhm.
you purchase a robot, not only are you purchasing the arm, but you can also purchase quote unquote add-ons, right? Whether that is hardware or
Yep.
software unlocks. I guess I learned quite a bit that there's many differences there. And so my takeaway, instead of being how to say it, like I've changed my mind on that being an easy process or an easy decision to make. I think like a lot more needs to go into deciding which platform you want to go to, and maybe even maybe even to the point that one area of the facility would require one specific brand of arms, and some other area of a facility may require something different, right? So I think looking at
Interesting.
and again, I'm thinking as an outsider to robotics to some extent, but I'm thinking, if it's a simple palletizing application, you could probably
Mhm,
choose kind of whatever, as long as there's not
mhm.
huge bottlenecks on speed. But when it's like automotive and you need like high speed coordination, then it's going to require a little bit more research, right? So if you can save money on the palletizer to go with whatever the cheapest brand is, that probably makes sense. But when it comes to that highly automated, highly coordinated motion, you probably will have to go with something very specialized.
Interesting. So I will kind of make the point to that. Earlier this month, I had polled the LinkedIn audience and asked them if they had a preferred brand of robot.
Mhm,
And those are always interesting conversations, especially along the robotic side, because a lot of them, to your point, Vlad, are very application specific. But there were a couple of comments basically along the lines of, most people don't pick robotic arms, right? So most people aren't going and saying, hey, I want one robot or I need five robotic arms. Most people are buying cells, most people are buying solutions to applications. So if I buy a palletizer and the palletizer has a robot in the palletizer, most of the time, unless you have very much specifically picked, one brand of robot that you want across your facility, you are getting whatever robot that group uses. And
mhm,
so I think that is an interesting and perhaps important distinction, something that I suppose I didn't necessarily consider before I asked the question, but going back, I think it could very much be, maybe not today in 2023, but into the future, I think it could very much be something along the lines of controllers, right? There are some people who only want, one particular brand of controller and they've standardized on the controller. And if it comes with a different brand, we're ripping it out and putting the brand that we have because we've got one brand or maybe a couple of models and that's what we use and that's what we know how to use, versus most people, I guess many more facilities that they might have 50 to 8% one brand, but they might go buy skids or other pieces of equipment that come with another brand, and they are not brand devoted enough to go remove that and go kind of standardize everything. And I know you and I, Vlad, have had conversations in the past with both of us having gone through the process of completely re-engineering everything because a group that we were working for or working with decided, hey, this is the one type of controller. So I think into the future, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a bunch of people standardize on Fanuc or ABB or KUKA or any other specific type of robot. But I think we'll see lots of application specific solutions. And I think that goes to motion. I think it goes to payload. I think it goes to application. As we've talked about and further conversations, and I'm sure we'll get to robotics as a service when we talk about, hey, this is the application that this type of robot is used for, and if we've got like a 12 kg payload of a robot that does welding, that robot is not suddenly going to become our I don't know, our KUKA 1 ton that can go move everything and does palletizing or flipping cars for paint or something along those lines. So I think that someone probably has a really good matrix that exists, Vlad. I don't currently have that matrix, but I feel like as we're going through and talking about these applications, that matrix has become more and more existent in my mind of this is probably why we see so many different brands and colors of robots in any given facility.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. I would agree. If we want to move on to the second conversation we've had, which was with Courtney Fernandez, who
Hmm.
is currently working out of California for United Robotics Group. And I think that they have a slightly different flavor of robotics
Hmm.
than just the arms, right? So they do a lot of
Hmm.
AMRs. They have a couple of lines that they've announced of robots, which are, like restaurant and hospitality type of robots. However, Courtney was specifically brought in by a guest that we've spoken to on the podcast
Hmm.
actually last year, Greg, and so she's primarily responsible for the industrial side of the United
Hmm.
Robotics Group, and she'll probably get a chance, to experiment with those AMRs. But she's mostly, she talked to us about AMRs that use industrial arms on top of them, and ultimately, I think the use case, or I guess like where would this be interesting? Well, material handling, right? So I think that
Hmm.
just a pure AMR shows up to a line with raw materials, or needs to bring like finished goods from the line, let's call it, to a palletizing area. It becomes difficult to transfer that material from the robot to, let's say, the production line, right? And so we had a discussion with Courtney where she said, well, an arm could be installed on the AMR, and then by using a vision system on top of those things, you can also very accurately pinpoint. And I guess like I've not seen these like live myself, but I'm assuming like some kind of a target, right? Like a QR code or like a position
Hmm.
marker. The vision system picks that up. It can realign the field of view because ultimately the AMR um, cannot be, I guess, like millimeter accuracy positioned, right? And so it's probably I think the metric she mentioned in the conversation was within an inch, right? So the
Okay.
AMR will come in like within an inch, and so you need to correct with the vision system in order to accurately, like pick up the material and
Hmm.
place it wherever it's needed. So I think that application is certainly really interesting. I think that I've seen many facilities that still, like, the operator is essentially the one who's going to put, whether it is boxes, if it's like raw ingredients, it could be loading glue into, like your case packers. And so I think there's a lot of interesting applications that could be
Hmm.
done with something like that. But I guess I don't remember the exact like costs, and maybe we had that conversation like later
With Dave,
with
yeah.
uh with Dave. So I'm not sure if it's cost effective yet for those kind of simple applications, but maybe in like specialized material handling, it would make
Hmm.
a little bit more sense. But what were your thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, let me, I guess, start with that last comment. And we talked a bit more about AMRs with Dave Neville, who was episode 135. And we'll kind of blend that part of the conversation. So I think they do a lot at Infinity Robotics. I think they do a lot of AMRs. I think that it is continuing to be a large part of their business. And we talked about a bunch of interesting use cases. I think Dave's comment is that historically in AMR, and there are small payloads and multi ton payloads, but historically kind of a normal warehousing robot is in the I think 45 to $50,000 price point. I believe was the number that he said. I know he specifically said that they're working with a group or a couple of groups to help bring that down closer at volume in the 25 to 30 or $35,000 range, which is really breaking open a bunch of opportunities. And I will throw out a number because I think it's mostly just additive, and I will not necessarily attribute it to anyone. I think that the concept of like a robotic arm on an AMR is somewhere in the call it $100,000 range, which is basically the two parts added together. And so at that price point, I'm not necessarily sure that filling glue in a case packer is going to satiate the need to go invest the
Right.
$100,000. But what I find interesting is that for the longest time, we have seen people put, especially UR robots, on carts, right? And so that way
Mm.
we can go like manually, but geographically locate and relocate those carts so it can do two tasks, it can do five different tasks, it can do some number of tasks that we need it to do. And we've seen it do a bunch of, and I guess I've personally seen it do a bunch of quality and other type inspections, which is at least conceptually super interesting when it comes to that. And so I think that as we see those price points come down, I would imagine we're going to see those manually geographically relocated carts get swapped out to more AMRs because it will make more sense, right? If then it allows us to, at least in theory, completely remove the person, and it allows the robotic entity, if you will, to go through the process of completely yeah, it allows the robotic entity to go through the process of completely configuring itself for a number of different tasks or a number of different tasks that it has to do across the day. So maybe it gets to the point of we can do all, I don't know, four or eight of our case packers or all 20 different glues that need to go get refilled over the course of the day. Maybe it goes through and once a shift either checks and refills or perhaps just refills what that looks like. And maybe at that point it becomes cost effective enough to go start looking at those solutions. So I think those are super interesting. I also want to throw out some of the other applications Courtney talked about that Universal Robotics Group was working on because they're just kind of a little wild, right? So you talked about restaurants, and so we talked with Courtney kind of briefly about some of the robotics that they're working on to go replace wait staff, to go replace other things. And so like plates or a tray gets put on the back of this robot that has a face, which still ekes me out. And then it shows up at the table, and people can go get their food. I think that that is a interesting application. I don't know how necessary it is. I don't know necessarily the cost of those. I think it's an interesting application. And then beyond just that particularly interesting application, I think that that concept, and I believe we talked about this on the show with Courtney, like that may be, hey, we load everything that we need to go do a changeover if we're doing a lot of like very manual changeover processes. And then when we're done with wherever we are in production, the robot shows up with the changeover stuff, and we don't have to worry about the large percentage of people going and running around to go find changeover stuff. Not necessarily in large corporations, but in lots of small and medium organizations I've worked with. I've seen changeovers go 3 or 4 times longer than they need to because you can't find the seventh wrench for the seventh different sized screw or nut
Yeah.
that you need in order to go change everything.
That also kind of like begs the question, and I don't believe there's a tool right now to be able to, I guess, like evaluate those different solutions, right? But I'm assuming,
Mhm.
let's say, an application where I need to load glue from,
Mhm.
let's call it like some kind of a box, it could be a pallet or a tub,
Yep.
into like, let's say, like a glue gun apparatus.
Yep.
Um, like the robot in AMR is going to be significantly smaller in my mind than if you want to load, let's say, a spool of paper onto, like a spindle. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering if there's going to be a tool to be able to like size those applications. And in my
Okay.
mind, the question then becomes, well, how small and like how inexpensive of a robot vision AMR combo I could get versus the application, and you know what I mean, like maybe make the
Hmm.
evaluation accordingly, because I think that we bundled that under, let's say, like 100K, but maybe
Yep.
there is an option which is just a your arm rolling around on like a plastic cart, and that's sufficient for like a glue application, right? So I'd be curious
Hmm.
again, like to see someone, maybe like a distributor, to come up with some kind of a pricing chart. I think we didn't
Hmm.
really dive into that conversation, but maybe there are cost-effective ways in combining those three. And also, you know, what's the? I think we got some answer from Courtney and Dave when it comes to the integration side of those three
Hmm.
sort of components. But I still think there's a there's probably like a one-off cost. Let's say if you want to build like one of those carts, right? Like there's the
Hmm.
initial setup cost, but then if I want to order 10 of them, then it
Hmm.
should become in theory cheaper because we've already developed the software to combine those three together. And so I don't know
Yep.
how many like engineering hours truly go into that cost versus just again like the AMR and the ARM and then the vision system. So
I
anyways, I think it's go ahead,
Yeah,
go
no,
ahead.
I think it's an interesting kind of math or economic problem, and I would say the only way that, and we'll use going and filling the glue, right? So I think if we are going and making sure that the glue is filled and refilled in all of our case packers and all of our other items, that is an application that lots of people see. So I think in theory you could do that at scale. Again, I think if you want run one line or two lines, that's not the only thing you'd want to use it for, but perhaps at 10 or 20 lines, and especially if you go 24 by 7, I think that could potentially make sense. I don't know if that would be like one full-time equivalent of a person over the course of all 3 to 5 shifts, but I would
Mhm.
imagine it would probably be somewhere close. So could one in theory save 40 or 50 or 60 or $80,000 a year in labor costs by not by going and having one of these setups? And I think that if the number is, we'll call it $80,000 a year, I would imagine in volume someone, not Dave and Vlad, could come up with one of those, because I think Dave Neville said that at volume they were looking at AMRs in the, I think, 25,000, maybe $30,000 price range, which again, according to him, seemed to be a bit of a game changer. So
Mhm.
I think when we look at that, and then we'd have a smaller robotic arm. So maybe it's only 50. I'm really bad at guessing prices of what robotic arms look like, but call it $50,000. That puts us at $75,000, and then we could go and put some vision in there. We could go do some engineering time. Again, I'd imagine it would be a mostly engineered application, but I'd imagine you could get it to the approximately $100,000 price level, especially if you're delivering hundreds of these as a distributor or solutions provider over the course of the year. So to me, it seems like an interesting thought concept. And I actually want to go take that thought and go kind of roll over into our conversation with Dave. So again, Dave Neville, of Infinity Robotics, episode 135. And I want to frame this conversation around the conversation that we had with him about robotics as a service. And Vlad, I have a bunch of thoughts on it. I will let you take first crack at that conversation, either continuation of could we turn this into an actual design and idea, or what Dave shared with us as robotics as a service.
Yeah, so I guess my initial impression, right? So my understanding of robotics as a service was more of a
Hmm.
monthly contract, and I think
Hmm.
that it's as he explained, it's more of a lease agreement. So I think that
Yeah.
changes my thoughts a little bit, right? I guess like my understanding is that you're more locked in than I originally expected. That being said, I think understanding the finances of these, I want to say like deals or assets, makes me fairly comfortable negotiating, or I guess like purchasing either way, right? Like whether it is like a full lump sum, or is it, you know, like a payment over a certain number of years, or again, I guess like my thought is that it's not as revolutionary as it is sometimes portrayed. I think that you could have probably gotten a loan on a robot, right, in order to purchase that $300,000 arm on a certain interest rate from a bank or a private lender, or even from probably the distributor or the OEM. So I guess my perception is that it's a fairly straightforward structure, which makes the play on the CapEx versus OpEx opportunity. And I think they're taxed in different brackets. Again, I'm not super familiar with the tax laws, but from my understanding, by putting those dollars, if you will, in a different bucket, you can benefit
Mm,
from additional savings. So I think it certainly makes sense, right? Like if
mhm,
you're in accounting or if you're like a CFO type of person, you need to make sure that you allocate the budgets accordingly. But I wouldn't say it's entirely revolutionary, like as a concept overall.
mm,
I'll also make the comment, and I think there was a thread, as a result of our conversation with Dave, but also a couple of comments that Sean Dotson had made, like himself. I think that in general, this pricing model is seen in all industries, right? And I think that the
mhm,
reason why we hadn't seen it before was because you couldn't easily monitor the systems that have been deployed, right? And I think that the the model is not necessarily new. I think it's just that people are pushing back on it because we've always just had a option to purchase something as a lump sum, and we've
yep,
never had this like different, I want to say, model, just because we simply, it was difficult to track, right? And the only place we
mhm,
saw that is primarily in mortgages and vehicles, right? Like you get a long-term loan. So I think this model definitely makes sense. I think we saw the same thing in SaaS, right? But hardware in my mind is no different. And so
mhm,
it will make sense for certain cases. It's going to be disadvantageous in others, but ultimately, it opens up the market. I want to say like a little bit more for those edge cases. That really is what I think it is doing.
absolutely. I would agree with that, and I I guess to extrapolate a bit upon what Vlad was saying, if you guys aren't super familiar with the robots as a service concept, it is typically the agreements are at minimum 3 years. I think we've heard kind of the normal agreements are between 3 to 5 years. And then outside of going and selling at a per hour rate or a per day, week, month rate, it becomes the services are included, right? So the yearly or 2 or 3 times a year that normal services have to come out for to go support the robot. If there is a breakdown on the robot, those are also covered within the overall cost. And I would agree, with Vlad's comments, and I think that most people that I have talked to about this model in the comments and otherwise are generally in agreement that it's not super revolutionary. You're basically leasing a robotic arm in this instance. And the vast majority of people are not going to be able to. Well, I guess the vast majority of people, it doesn't make sense for them to say yes to this. If you are an organization that has enough money to go out and do a $200,000 or more capex project, then it almost exclusively is going to make more financial sense to go down the path of we're just going to go buy it. We're going to pay someone to integrate it for us, because then we get to depreciate it as an asset because we get to go through the process of doing all of these other things. So, having said that, again, I think that there is, I don't know, 10%, maybe 20% of people that it is appealing to because they don't have the access to the additional capital. I will say with interest rates now at 6 to 8%, it's a very different conversation than when they were basically you could go acquire money for free. Back when you're acquiring money for free, you don't have to factor in the additional interest. Now that the additional interest is more money, then it becomes, hey, we've got to go charge more money for the capital that either we're loaning or we have come to go appreciate. So on the robotic arm side, I think to Dave Neville, he made a really great point, is that They aren't selling a lot of robotics as a service when it comes to robotic arms, but what they are doing is they're starting a bunch of conversations, right? So conceptually, if I say, "Hey, Vlad, this system costs $300,000," you're going to be a lot more skeptical, but of, "Hey, I don't want to go spend the money." But if you go through the process and say, "Hey, Vlad, we could potentially lease this to you for as low as 28 or $30 an hour," then it's like, well, it's only 28 or $30 an hour. It may be approximately what one worker is after all the expenses, etc. Let's go have the conversation. And then to Dave Neville's point, it could very much become the, hey, you go through the process, you look at it, you present the two options to the CFO. The CFO says, "Hey, I'm just going to go pay for this. And by the way, I just saved us $100,000, and it looks good in the CFO bonus check mark." I I will make the important distinction with the AMR conversations we're having. I I guess because AMRs are going to take more wear and tear, because AMRs are going to need their wheels replaced once or twice or maybe more often because there's more service. And I think because they are less expensive up front, conceptually, robots as a service or AMRs as a service could make more sense to an organization because one, you don't know how long you're going to need them, and two, it may be a short term, 2 or 3 year lease before you upgrade to something else, as opposed to, hey, we've integrated this robotic arm. Basically, once we've integrated this robotic arm into the process, it's almost certainly going to live here forever, right? I'm not going to rent it for 3 years and then opt to rip it out unless there's some other issue with it. I think with AMRs, with solutions like that, they are much more easily interchangeable, especially as we see batteries degrade and additional technologies continue to improve in the coming years.
Yeah, and it's to be honest with you, like it also raises the question, when it comes to robots specifically or hardware, is how is this any different than, let's call it, I show up to a distributor and they quote me, let's call it 200K for like a specific robot arm and then application. Why can't I just turn around, go to my bank and say like, hey, can I get a loan, obviously like a business loan for that
Hmm.
200K, and I can ultimately also deduct the interest rate on my,
Yep.
like on that expense. And so I think, to make the point for software, right? Like why SaaS in my mind is interesting is because I want to get the new features and updates, right? So I'm paying for development. And so I hopefully expect, the application that I'm paying for, whether it is like a business application or it is something smaller, like an iPhone application, then hopefully it improves over the course of me paying for it, right? Versus in this case, what I find a bit not necessarily strange, but I would assume that the whoever sold you that robotic cell is not going to come in and say like, oh, like we've made this improvement and now it's going to run better. So I think that they'll have to find a way to differentiate themselves versus the like pure bank loan in this scenario in order to make it, I want to say, like worthwhile. And I think we've had that like brief conversation how they're introducing, like other tools and but it wasn't entirely like clear to me again why you couldn't just get a loan against those assets and just as much benefit from those, I want to say, like financial deductions, if not more, by going that kind of like loan route. But anyways, I think it's going to be interesting. I hope to see like more sort of meat on the bone when it comes to robotics as a service in general. That would be like
I
my perspective.
I would agree. I guess let me give you an example of where I kind of initially fell in love with the concept of robotics as a service. So, as everyone knows, I work with a bunch of kind of small and medium sized companies, and I feel like this is very much a play towards those. So one of those groups I was working with was a kind of small to medium sized co-packer, and they were in this process of a huge expansion, but they had an issue on the single line that they currently had, and that kind of reoccurring issue over and over again was they just had this very painful issue with their palletizer, right? And it wasn't a very fast palletizer. It wasn't very technical. We were literally taking cases, those cardboard cases of beer and sodas and all of those other things, and we were putting them on one of honestly way too many different formations that we could go possibly put those 36 packs on. And so with them, they conceptually would have loved a new palletizer. Their issue was that they quite literally couldn't afford it with all of the expansion that was going on, right? And so the palletizer was a constant pain point. So for them, I guess one, there weren't palletizers that they could go purchase. We went out and looked, and I think that we could have jumped a line, and it was still going to be 8 months. And so because of that, and they didn't have the two or $300,000 that it was going to go take to bring it in, because they were going through this large expansion. They quite literally didn't have capital that wasn't just working capital to go purchase a new palletizer. So for them, if
They
there
couldn't
was
get a
in
loan?
theory, no, they were capped out on money to be borrowed from banks and other places. And so
But so
I
why
think
would the
for groups,
vendor then give them that loan, right?
why
Well,
would the
let's say if I'm
vendor
if
give?
I'm let's say I'm a distributor of robot as a service, why would
Yeah.
I give them an asset like that if they're unable to like get a loan from the bank? Because you're essentially like a private lender at that point.
I mean, to some extent, you're a private lender, but you're a secured private lender because worst case scenario, you get your asset back, right? Like if there is an
Mm.
issue with payment, or if there, again, there was no worry that the organization was going to go bankrupt. They have just capped out because they were in the middle of an 80 or $100 million expansion in which they built two buildings and they were bringing in two or three or four different lines. And so they just didn't have the extra couple $100,000 that it was going to take, because again they were floating all of this other working capital as they were going through this major expansion. So in that sense, it would have made sense business and financial wise if someone had a palletizer, and it could have even been in theory a refurbished palletizer, because again the cycle time was very slow. Of let's go through the process of taking out the old palletizer, putting in a new robotic palletizer, because the cycle time is so slow. And then if they were going to commit, even they were running 24 by 7 for most of the time that I was there. So if they were running 24 by 7 and it was going to cost them $30 an hour of all of those 24 by 7, that would have been that would have been a very enticing proposition.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that makes
But again,
sense.
if you're working for any organization that has a fortune, any number in front of it, it almost exclusively is not going to make sense to go rent a palletizer. I would also say
Hmm.
that particular group was only planning on running that line, hopefully for another couple of years as they got the new lines up, right? So the new lines would go up, and then that line probably would have just become an R&D line. As to if they would have even needed a palletizer, I don't know. So if they could have gone and rented a palletizer for a couple of years, and then in theory said, hey, we don't need the palletizer anymore, you guys can come take this, that in theory could have, I guess that is a very specific use case, which is again why I think in those use cases there is a 5 to 10 or maybe 20% of applications that make sense, because we are looking to acquire it for a short period of time and don't necessarily have the capital to allow us to acquire it. And yeah, if you don't have the capital, then kind of a rent to own solution makes more sense.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I guess because you're ultimately paying for the risk of you not having the capital to support operations. It's interesting. I don't know. It
Yeah,
seems like
I,
from Hmm? I was gonna
I,
say from the
I
vendor side, it sounds like the worst kind of target or market to be in. But
so I made a post about robots as a service a couple of days, I think last week, towards the end of last week, and said something kind of very similar, because again we had a really good conversation with Dave, and then we had Sean Dotson in the comments, and Sean brought a bunch of this math, and again I think it makes sense as a math, right? So I don't see like we'll use $28 an hour because it's a good round number. If you're running one shift 5 days a week, if I am the vendor, I cannot make $28 an hour work, right? If I'm running 24/7, then I, in theory, can make something perhaps as low as $28 an hour work. But more realistically, we're probably in the call it $50 an hour price range, right? So this has to be worth about $50 an hour for that to make sense. And then I would say on the vendor side, there is, hey, we need to go find something that is highly that we can easily replicate. We could, in theory, go reuse either the entire cell or we could go at least reuse the robotic arm. And so I think that there are applications like case packing. I think there's applications like palletizing. There might be applications like depalletizing, things that most facilities are going to have, that it makes sense. And if I have to go take it from this one facility, which no one particularly wants to do, we could easily go replace it in another facility. Like it may even be to a fairly small cell of pick and place, right? And so it's not going to be a novel concept. And I think we talked about a bit with this with Dave about a product versus a engineered solution, right? Like this very much has to be, it's a product. We can go deploy, I don't know, 20, 500, 1,000 of these over the course of a year. And if 10% of them come back, we are still net positive because we're making an extra $100,000 over the course of 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense.
I guess I will make the point that if you guys are a smaller vendor, a systems integrator, a niche service provider, and this sounds like it's a risky proposition, it almost exclusively is a risky proposition. Vlad and I are not saying that anyone should go in to robotics as a service. There are a bunch of groups that go offer this and provide financing, and I think there are some groups that allow this to make sense, that it works. But no, I thought it was an awesome conversation that we got to have with Dave. Do you have any other thoughts on robots as a service or anything else before we move forward, Vlad?
Nope, I do not.
Awesome. So I will make the point of we had an issue with the LinkedIn event. It was supposed to go live at 12 noon, and I go look at my LinkedIn profile. And if you guys are watching on LinkedIn, thank you guys for watching. But as I go look at my LinkedIn profile, I see some number of people watching us live at the moment. But for the life of me, I literally cannot, like, I see it on the top of my profile. I cannot get into it. So if you guys are watching, hello. If you guys are writing comments, thank you. Literally cannot see anything at this point. Vlad has dropped the link to the Manufacturing Hub YouTube channel. Props to the Manufacturing Hub YouTube channel where you can go catch all of these live events as well. Or please feel free to message Vlad or myself with questions, comments, etc. After the show. Having said that, let's go move to the conversation that we had on Wednesday with Ryan Lillibridge from Mission Robotics and Automation. I think I got that correct, from Mission, up in Western Michigan. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. It felt like it continued a bunch of the applications that we were talking about. From my perspective, or kind of from our conversation, they do a lot of robotic arms. Ryan actually had I think it was an ABB robotic arm
That was
behind
a
him.
Fennec.
Was it a
It was a
Fennec?
Fennec.
Okay,
It was like a Cobot Fennec. Yep.
interesting. And so he had that behind him. It was white. When Fanics aren't painted yellow, it confuses me, Vlad. I am a simple guy. I look at the colors of things, and if it's yellow, it should be Fanic. If it is orange, it should be Kuka. If it is white, it's probably in my mind an ABB that came from our friends up in Loop, because all of their ABBs are painted white as opposed to red. But no, having said that, I thought it was a really awesome conversation. Oh, did I freeze?
No, I see you.
Oh, okay. I froze on my end, which was a unique thing. But no, I thought it was a really awesome conversation that we got to have with Ryan. Yeah, I guess maybe before we jump into that, Glad you and I haven't had a large conversation around cobots, and I feel like cobots continued to come up. I personally think that they're interesting, and it's been interesting over the course of the last, and I don't know if it's true, the course of the last 2 or 3 years that we're seeing more people introduce cobots, but there are more cobots that are certainly aware to me beyond just a bunch of the Universal Robots cobots that are coming out. I don't know if it's the popularity of the UR for all of the easy applications, and in theory the lack of safety enclosures around them if the applications are intrinsically safe. But I thought that was very interesting. Do you have any thoughts as to the rise of at least the cobots that we're seeing in trade shows and the cobots that we are seeing on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think my opinion changed that much over the last year. I think, like, in general, they probably have their place. I believe that it all comes down to financials at the end of the day, right? Because I think we all understand that a robot is meant to move object A from, point B to C, let's call it. And so if you can do that cheaper by not having guarding, by having less protection, but ultimately at the sacrifice of, let's call it, that transition speed, then cobots will make sense for you, right? But in my conversations, any like high speed application, anything that requires like a lot more precision, I think that the traditional robots are still a lot more cost effective, right?
Hmm.
So is that going to change? I think I guess, like, in my mind, and I think that was kind of a conversation we had a bit with Dave and Ryan. The technology, let's call it that, that goes into making a cobot is probably going to get cheaper and cheaper,
Hmm.
because I think a lot of that is like software based, right? And again, like, don't
Yep.
quote me on this. I'm sure that sensors go into that as well, but I think it will slowly like converge where the price of a cobot is going to be fairly close to, let's say, a traditional robot, and the constraints are probably going to be similar, right? And again, like, that's just my view on how the industry is going to go. And if that's the case, then at some point it's going to make more sense to just buy cobots by default, right? If they are as
Hmm.
performant and as good as a normal robot, then I don't see why not, right? And you
Hmm.
could either enable that feature and put them without guarding, or disable
Hmm.
that feature and put them next to humans. But for the time being, like I said, I think that a high speed application that is optimized for throughput is probably going to be a traditional robot, and then if you have some special requirement that allows a cobot to come in, then you're probably going to go with that. So.
Absolutely, and I think the economics of robotics was an interesting conversation and kind of theme
Mhm.
that we had with the last 2 or 3 guests. I don't know, I don't remember how much we got into it, the economic side with Courtney, but on my side, as I think I remember Dave specifically saying that once we go put safety around a robot, it is a very close price as to what a cobot is going to, I guess, a fully functioning cobot is going to cost. So it's not like I am buying a robot in a cell for, we'll go really big, for like $400,000, and a cobot is $20,000. I think that
Mm.
they're much closer in that somewhere between 60 to $100,000 range. In my mind, 80-ish thousand dollars was about the correct price point to go do that. I think Dave. I know we talked a bunch about UR with Courtney, and she had an interesting application where an older version of the UR robots, it had gotten boxed incorrectly and literally ripped the teach pendants off. And because the older version of the teach pendants were hardwired in to the to the cobots, they were unable to go deploy both of them without basically ripping off control boxes and going through the process of overnighting some new parts. And so they've seen those go either wireless, or they've seen those go to the process of they are much more interchangeable. which I thought was interesting. And I think Dave had made the comment of we're seeing a lot more cobots come out of China and come out of Asia, and it will be interesting to see if the price depresses. Right, from my understanding, the prices stayed very similar throughout the, I don't know, basically the existence of the cobot. It'll be interesting to see if cobots come down in price. And I think if cobots start to come down in price, then it will be interesting to see what other additional applications we have, or if the market decides people are willing to pay the dollar amount that they're currently willing to pay, we are going to stay at this price point and maybe find a couple of points of margin as we go build additional tens and hundreds of thousands of these.
Yeah, the only item like I would add, Dave, I think it's hard to compare apples to apples without knowing which parameters you're comparing, right? So I think when people talk a lot about, let's call it like the normal robot is 70K and then a similar cobot, let's call it like 80 or 90K,
Mm-hmm.
I think they only consider the payload, but
Yep.
they don't necessarily consider the speed, right? And so from my conversations, again, I've not seen this like personally myself.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that the cobot, it will be intrinsically a lot slower, and I've heard like 4x slower as the number.
Okay.
And so I think then you're not really comparing, like I said, it could be a small difference in price, but it's a huge difference in throughput, right? And so if
Yep.
obviously if you don't care if it's something like loading component into a CNC machine, well, it doesn't really matter. But if you're looking to do something at speed, then
Mm-hmm.
it's like completely different in terms of like price ranges, right? So again, I'm hesitant to make a conclusion because I don't understand like all those numbers and parameters. But I think that it will get closer and closer as time goes by.
Absolutely. I agree that I think it it is very application dependent, right? And if you're doing something at a slower cycle time, the speed of each of those robotic arms and robotic cells matter less than if you are doing something at fast speed, right? So if I'm doing something at, I don't
Hmm.
know, 10 pieces a minute, I would imagine most robots are going to be able to go pick up and go move those, for example, 10 pieces over the course of a minute. If I am doing 400 over the course of a minute, I probably have multiple high speed robotic arms or gantries that are going to go through the pick and place process or removal process because that is what the application is going to drive on. And I don't know. And if there's someone listening to us that knows the answer, I don't know if cobots are good or useful or currently being used in high speed applications. If they are, I'd certainly like to see some examples of that because I think that that would be interesting. And as all of our longtime listeners know, Vlad and I do some not insignificant part of these to ask super selfish questions and to do more learning. And we like to go bring everyone here along with the learning. Speaking of learning, to go kind of take it back to one last point that Ryan really hit on, and I felt was good, and I felt was very much a theme throughout the entirety of our conversation, is the inclusion of vision and all of these other kind of sensors and applications. And I think you brought it up at the very beginning, Vlad, and I think it's worth going and hammering one more time. Is very rarely are people systems integrators, robotics experts, just going and driving one particular robotic arm and saying, "Hey, this is the robotic arm. We've done the thing." Right? Most of the time, it's going to include vision sensors. It's going to include maybe some safety, maybe one of those AMRs. Right? It is not just robotics is robotic arms. It's robotics is robotic arms plus vision plus safety plus AMRs plus all of these other things that come in order to drive the applications. And I guess, at least from my perspective, is it certainly seems like we have had only conversations inclusive of all these other parts. And I feel like having all these conversations inclusive of other parts is just kind of going and driving robotics as a whole into a much more technologized, much more specialized solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the maybe how to say like maybe that's a intentional, I want to say, like marketing push where, let's say, even on the cobot side, you see a lot of advances being made on how to program the robot and how simple it is to just, plop it in your facility, and someone with zero knowledge of engineering could set this thing up to go from point A to B. But the more people that I talk to, the more I realize that the challenges, if anything, became more complex because they now require the integration of all those components that you've mentioned, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that in some ways, I guess, like, I would almost use the word like misleading, that just because you can program or set up the robot itself, you're sort of like done with that application, right? And I think
Yep.
even a couple of our guests said, like, well, if you're going from point A to point B, like, yes, like that's like perfectly fine. But usually when you want to incorporate all of those other elements, it is quite a bit more challenging, and if anything, it has become a bit more complex, because again, we demand higher speeds, we demand higher accuracy, we demand fairly complex, pick and place applications that require fairly deep machine vision and image recognition. So I think it's interesting. I'm curious to see like where the industry is going to go, and I'm also curious to see how those partnerships are going to develop on the OEM side, right? Because I think it's in, let's call it, both on, like, let's pick like a vendor, like in Cognex's advantage to
Hmm.
create, like a very tight integration with, let's say, a robot manufacturer than what is currently available in the space, right? And so I'm curious to see if those relationships will develop. I think right now everybody wants to some extent stay agnostic. And then, if I'm again not mistaken, UR has like a marketplace where, vendors
Hmm.
can go and submit their libraries that kind of plug into like their hardware. I don't know how good that infrastructure is,
Hmm.
but I think we're going to see more and more of that in our space when it comes to those specialized tools, which, as you said, are almost always there now, right? Like, we're like I said, something basic, A to B. You get a robot arm, you get an end of arm tool, and it doesn't even need to plug into like a PLC at this point, except maybe some very basic I/O, right? It's ready, it's not ready, it's faulted, and that's it. But it's gonna be interesting.
Absolutely.
I think it offers a lot of opportunity.
Well, I for one am certainly excited to go look at the advances we're going to make over the course of the next year between us talking about robotics now and the next time that we talk about robotics. There are always a bunch of awesome shows that show a bunch of really interesting robotics applications, and I am excited to go see kind of that continuation of the trickle down as we go bring more people into the ecosystem and as we go watch more robotic arms and other automation be delivered to see the interesting and novel use cases that everyone comes up with.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, we spoke about this a bit with Ryan as well. I think there's a lot more to robotics than just the arms and
Mhm.
the AMRs. So that's why I'm very curious again, like these specialized slash like edge applications, how we're going to, I think we're going to see more different companies like try out those different use cases. And I had given like one example in that conversation, but how to say it, like, I guess I hesitate to commit what the status of the future is going to look like, because I think there's still a lot of like trial and error with these, like bipedal robots. And
Mhm.
I think it's more so than just the technical aspect, right? I think we can, and I can't remember which guest said this, but if we, in enough time and money, we can make it work. But ultimately, like, it needs to be cost effective, right? So even if we think a bipedal robot like the dog from Boston
Spot.
Dynamics, like, it can be used in certain applications. Well, like, is that the most cost effective? And I don't know, right? Like, maybe there will be some use cases,
Mhm.
and maybe they won't. But it's going to be interesting to see. And I guess, like, if we want to transition to the conversation of, like, where do we see opportunities?
Mhm.
I like software plays and those like integrations between robots and other systems. If anything, I think that there's an interesting idea to be implemented, which is that you could program the robot. And I think like RoboDK, and again, I don't have a ton of experience with it, has done something to what I'm about to propose, which is you can program in a non-proprietary language, right? You can program in any language through their interface and then load that program or sequence into any robot brand. And I obviously understand, the constraint is you're probably not going to get as precise as, let's say, like 100% edge cases, but I think you can apply the 80/20 rule and it gets you kind of 80% there. So I think software is very much interesting when it comes to robots, but also tying all of these systems together. As far as I know, it's not that easy to bring in. It's possible. There's connectors, but robot data into like a live dashboard of what's going on, what kind of errors there are. Like I
Mhm.
think some of them offer the service, but it's not as optimal as I would like for it to be per se. Do you see any interesting like opportunities on the robot side?
Yeah, so I think that kind of you talked a little bit about the interconnectedness, right? And I think that Ryan, on our last episode, he was certainly talking about going and doing machine tending, doing a bunch of other things as a continued demand of applications. And personally, for me, as we couple applications and cells together, right? So as we have a robot go set something and another robot or some sort of automation go move it down a conveyor belt and pick it up, those always become more difficult, and those always provide the opportunity to cause a bunch of business issues. So I think that those will be interesting. There is certainly the opportunity to go automate that via robotics or other things, but I think that that will be very interesting kind of as we go down that path. When we talk about data, I think that we will continue to see more and more data being pulled out. I've had a couple of conversations with people who are like, "Hey, we're going and we're pulling this data out of UR robots or other things," and at first, Vlad, I was a bit taken aback, right? So all of our longtime listeners know that Vlad and I have many conversations, inclusive of our background on data, and I'm like, "Wait, you mean we're going and delivering and deploying these robots and these applications and we're not collecting data on it? That seems kind of wild." But it is apparently the truth. I've done a bit of fact checking some of those, and it seems like there are lots of robots that can, in theory, be delivered without the ease or even ability for most people to go pull in that data into the rest of their control system. So I certainly see those use cases continuing to come forward. Of we will go find and use different ways to go pull that data in. So I think we will can see kind of the inclusion of those robotic cells into more of the MES, into more of the dashboarding, into more of those decision making processes. Because as we go grow the number of robots we're using, we have to go be able to effectively troubleshoot and understand problems with those cells as well. So I'm also interested in that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think again, like we're gonna see a lot of innovation in the space. I think with the rise of purchase of robotics that we saw last year, and I think it's gonna continue the trend this year, and ultimately the demand of it being simplified. Again,
Mhm.
I remain on the fence whether we're actually simplifying deployment of robots or we're making it more complex. But I think there's certainly going to be a rise in solutions that attempt to simplify it, to integrate it with other systems and sort of make it more streamlined simply because, well, number one, we don't have enough people doing that, but also it's very difficult to bring up a person that knows all of those disciplines, right? Like as we discussed with multiple guests, whether you want it or not, knowing robotics, knowing vision systems, and then knowing controls is becoming almost the minimal requirement for someone who's working on those AMRs with arms. You
Mhm.
know what I mean? And on top of that, software, right? So because they don't run in ladder logic. A lot of
Mhm.
them use some kind of a hub that is custom made and that processes that machine vision. So I think the complexity is rising. So my point is, I think there's going to be a lot of players that will try and simplify all of those integrations and all of those plays. in the next couple of years. And I think, if anything, I disagree a bit with Sean Dotson on this. I think more VC money will be poured in to solving those challenges. But maybe he was referring more like when it comes to like assets and companies that are pure like AI or data in manufacturing. But anyways, we'll see where the trends go. But I think there's a lot of money, a lot of opportunity to solve the challenges in robotics specifically.
Absolutely. No, I think that's exciting. I will say, if you guys have made it this far, thank you so much. October is again Cybersecurity Month on Manufacturing Hub, so please come hang out with us as we have 4 really awesome conversations with a bunch of people who hopefully know a lot more about ICS cybersecurity than Vlad or I. If you guys have made it this far, thank you so much. If you're watching on LinkedIn, again, thank you guys for hanging in there with us. We have somehow lost control of that, despite Vlad telling me last night that looked like an issue, and me telling him I've attempted to fix the issue. That is where we are. If you guys have thoughts or questions, please let us know. Please be sure to follow Manufacturing Hub as well as Vlad and myself. Thank you again to Solus PLC for sponsoring this. If you guys have made it this far on podcast form, please remember to like, share, subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and follow in all of the places you can do so. Again, when I ask, you guys do it. But until next Wednesday, we'll see everyone soon.